Welcome to another chapter in our video series on psychology. This time we're going to be looking at social psychology. Now, as you know, psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. So social psychology is the study of how those behaviors, how those thoughts are affected by others. And not only are we going to look at how people affect your behavior, we're going to also start by looking at how you think about other people. That's called social cognition. You see, humans are, as I've said several times in these videos, a social animal. If nothing else, we seem wired to prepare ourselves to interact and understand with multiple groups of people. So in this series of videos, we're going to start first as strangers, as men and women walking past each other. And as we move throughout the chapter, we'll start forming groups and start seeing how our behaviors are affected that way. So let's start first with passing each other, that perception of other men and women. Oftentimes we have just a few seconds to make decisions, but remember, your brain only needs that much time. Regardless of if it's right or wrong, your brain will take in quick pieces of information and begin to categorize and classify what it sees. So if you're walking down a hallway and a man walks by you and in just 2 seconds is the only exposure you have, if nothing else, you're going to perceive him as threat or not a threat. You may take in qualities such as skin color, height, the sex of the individual, the clothes they're wearing, the noise they're making if they're talking. You will grab a few quick factors, a few quick features, and you will put these people into categories. Because remember, your brain isn't necessarily considered or concerned with accuracy. It's concerned with knowing, or at least believing that the blanks are filled in. For example, if I were to show you this picture and say, who is she? What's her job? If you said doctor, what kind of doctor do you think she is? Do you think she's married or single? Now, without much evidence, I'm betting your brain came up with answers to those questions. You probably picked professions that or specialties in medicine you thought she applied to. You made estimates of decisions about married or not married. I don't know the answer to those questions. It's just a photo I found, but it reminds you that you need very little information to come to a conclusion about people that we see. And this should pretty much sound like a word that you're familiar with. But the content we're discussing is stereotypes. Now realize that stereotypes are not good and they're not bad. They simply are. We are wired to find patterns and hopefully to find meaning within patterns. Sometimes those patterns are correct and we call that learning. Other times, and just as often, those patterns are incorrect. Now the influence of stereotypes can be many, and I'm going to save much of my discussion on stereotypes when we get into actual group psychology. But for now, I'm going to bring a couple of examples I bet you've heard of. Self-fulfilling prophecy is the idea that if you're aware that a stereotype is being made about you and is constantly being made about you, you might actually shift your behavior, even unconsciously, to become that stereotype. So the kid that is often told he is bad or he is not smart is not surprisingly going to begin to act as if he is bad or if he's not smart. He's going to use that as sort of a projected way to engage in the world. Another example of this is a little bit more common for us, and that's our everyday first impressions. You might remember way back in our chapter on memory, we talked about that in a sequence. The serial position effect reminds us that we remember the beginning and the end the best. The beginning is called the primacy effect as a reminder, and first impressions are a good example of that. Stereotypes can be lasting. They can stay with us a long time. If the first time you met a person, or especially a person that represents to you a group of others you've never met before, that person's qualities may become the whole picture of how you see that group of individuals. If you meet someone for the first time and they're very nice to you, then the next time that you hang out with them, if they're a bit mean, a bit rude, a bit of a jerk, you might be more likely to forgive them because you remember them as a nice guy. However, if the first time you meet someone they're mean, they're a jerk, and the next time you engage with them they're nice and polite, you may be more likely to simply see them as a jerk who's being nice to you right now. Now we're talking about perceiving people, but we do more than just put them in a box based on qualities. We actually want to explain their behavior, and that's called making an attribution. Why people do what they do. We do this all the time, right? We watch TV and some celebrity will do some foolish activity or end up in jail. We will read in the paper or we'll hear stories about someone in high school doing something and we say to ourselves, I know what happened there. I can tell you why he did what he did. It turns out, whether we know it or not, we're all armchair psychologists. We believe, since we've had personal experience with others, and certainly we've just lived in a life being a human, that we can use that experience to explain why everyone does what they do. And to make attributions, you only need two people, an actor and an observer. As long as someone's behaving and someone's watching them, we make attributions. Now I'm going to share with you three different dimensions of attributions, because in a second I'm going to show you one of the most critical parts of this chapter, and certainly one of the things that I learned about myself and had to eventually start paying attention to. And that's going to be called the fundamental attribution error. But before we can learn that error, let's learn what attributions are. So we know they're making judgments about why people do, but let me give you some different types of attributions. The first is an internal attribution versus an external attribution. Internal attributions are when the reason he did what he did was because that's who he is. They're internal traits, they're internal abilities. So I put this example. If you say, why did she make an A on that test? Well, someone might say, well, that's easy. She's just smart. She always makes A's. She's just that type of student. Those are all internal attributions. The reason why she did what she did was because that's who she is. That's different from an external attribution. The reason that she got an A on the test was because the test was easy. See what happened? The attribution was why she did what she did was due to the environment, an outside force. Not who she is, something else. That's an external attribution. Our next pair is stable versus unstable. If you give someone a stable attribution, you're saying the reason he did what he did will always be the same. So if you see a couple fighting and you say, why are they arguing? Someone might say, he's an angry person. He's always arguing. That's just who he is. That's very different than an unstable attribution where you're saying the reason he's doing what he's doing is because of a circumstance in this moment. You see a couple arguing and you say, well, normally he's okay, but today he's having a bad day. Today he failed a test. Today he lost his job. That's why he's angry. That's an environmental circumstance. So already I've given you 4 attributions, but you should see a pattern. The first one sounds like the reason people do what they do is because of who they are. The second example's the reason people do things is because of the environment around them. And that brings us to 2 more. The final 2, controllable versus uncontrollable. And guess what? Those things are going to be exactly the same. Someone with controllable attribution, you're saying the reason he did what he did was something he had control over. The reason why he failed that test is he didn't study. The reason why he's soaking wet is he didn't look at the weather forecast. He could have brought an umbrella. What's different from uncontrollable? The reason why he or she did what they did was some other force, some other cause they don't have power over. The reason he failed that test is the instructor created a test no one could pass. The reason why his house was hit by a tornado was, regardless of knowledge of tornado belts, there's no way he could plan for that specific weather event. So that now brings us to the fundamental attribution error. So far you've got 6 attributions that are all leaning in 2 ways. Either you're going to explain someone's behavior because of who they are, or you're going to explain someone's behavior because of the circumstances that they're affected by. This error is that most of us, when explaining other people's behavior, we overestimate the internal traits and we underestimate the external or outside situations. So here's some examples I can put there. Remember, why did she pass that test? She's just smart. Why did he fail that test? He's just dumb. Why is he late to class? He's just lazy. Why is that person in prison? He's a bad person. That's where bad people go. I'm a good person. I don't go there. But there's a real problem with this, and hopefully you're starting to see it, that people's behaviors are more than just who they are. There's a number of environmental circumstances, a number of environmental situations. For example, when I think of the prison example, I wonder, has there ever been a good person who had to do a bad thing because of the circumstances he was in? Is there ever an example of a good person who did a good thing and still ended up in prison? And are there examples of people who are bad, but they're not in prison? The answer is yes to all of those questions. However, we don't like that. It doesn't keep the world simple. It doesn't keep it very neat and organized. The reason people do things is because that's just who they are. That's the fundamental attribution error. And that's very typical when someone's behavior is weird or bizarre to us. So if we see someone doing something that we simply cannot understand, we are much more likely to make the error and say it's just who they are. For example, when we look at cult members who've even killed themselves in the name of their cult leader, and we say, well, they must have been crazy, they're idiots, they're not smart, I would never do that. Well, I can tell you that after decades of research, we find the vast majority of members of cults have no history of mental illness, rated as psychologically normal. Only 5% of men and women have major psychological dysfunctions. Most of them, if we do give them a psychological diagnosis, it's typically things like depression or high anxiety. And so what we have to ask ourselves is, even though that behavior makes no sense to us, what would have led someone to engage in that behavior? Are there more variables at play than just that's who they are? As psychologists, you can't afford to paint with such a broad brush. So why do we make this error? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is heuristics, and that typically is a good word. You learned that in a couple of chapters ago. We said a heuristic is just kind of a shortcut. It's a rule of thumb, something that happened to you that reminds you of a specific circumstance. The danger here is we typically use our own lives as heuristics. So we might say, well, that person stole and they ended up in jail. Well, obviously that's their own fault because I've never stolen anything. So if I can live my life and not steal something, so can they. Well, that's not to excuse the behavior. We understand the importance of being responsible for actions, but really, can you say that the person you're talking about lived your exact life, that had all the variables you had, that had the same education, the same opportunities? The answer is no. We're all different. We all have different variables at play, biological and environmental. So sometimes we have to be careful of using our personal story as the heuristic for this case that we're trying to understand. And this sometimes becomes a broader problem, what we call the false consensus effect. The idea that we tend to believe that the world generally is like us and operates like us. So if you see a person or a group of people living somewhere who doesn't believe or doesn't act or doesn't talk like you, there must be something wrong with them internally because, hey, they're not like me, and most of the world is like me, right? You might be surprised. And finally, we make this error because of the self-serving bias, and this is something I see a lot in the classroom, and I'll be honest, I was certainly guilty of it as a student. The self-serving bias says that when we personally engage in a behavior that has a good outcome, we will use an internal attribution. But if we do something and there's a negative, a punishment outcome, we are much more likely to use an external attribution. So think about it. If I make an A on the test, it's because I'm smart. If I make an F on a test, it's because my teacher is a bad teacher. See what happened there? I suddenly changed the forces of internal or external. If you make an A on the test because you're smart, why isn't it when you make an F on the test it's because you didn't prepare? Well, we don't like to admit to our own internal traits being bad or producing bad results. And so you might have someone who comes late to class and I'll say, why is that person late to class? And you'll tell me, well, that person's lazy. Well, that's an internal attribution. But if I say, well, why were you late to class last week? Well, my kid had a problem. I had to go to the doctors, and the traffic was bad, and et cetera, et cetera. We see what happened? For you, suddenly, it was an external reason, not an internal one. That's the fundamental attribution error. And we have to recognize that these attribution errors can be a powerful force in changing our behavior. I'm giving you an example here called the stereotype thread that greatly illustrates this point. If you are aware that people are making attributions about you, especially if you realize or you identify with a minority, meaning, and that doesn't have to be race, it could be religion, politics, it could even be things like the music that you like or the friends that you have. But if you feel like you're the minority and people are making these attributions about why you do what you do. That stress, that anxiety can pile up, and it actually can change our behavior. Here's the example I mentioned. We once did a study where we went to a middle school, and all middle schoolers, no matter who they were, took the same test. Sort of like an achievement test that you may have done, such as the MAP test if you're from Missouri. So all middle schoolers had to take the same test. But randomly, half of the students had to take a test that had all the same questions, but where they wrote their name, they also had to identify what their race was. What we found was the boys and girls in the group that had the race box. That's the only difference in the test. But on average, those minority students, if they were in the minority, they ended up making, on average, worse than even the minority students who didn't have to check that box. It's as if simply acknowledging that you were part of a minority suddenly created a level of pressure that actually affected their grading. That's the power of these attributions. Now, day to day, we may use these attributions to help us just understand who we are. And as we wrap up this video, realize we're about to move into the idea of socialization. We're not just strangers identifying stimuli, but we're going to start hanging out with people, making friends, and being influenced by others. And so I do want you to realize that we use this concept of social comparison, that we like to evaluate ourselves based on others. And it's common, it's normal, right? If you're in a classroom and I give you your test back, let's say, well, the first thing you're going to do is look and see what you made on the test. But the second thing most of you will do is look over at your friend and see what they made, right? We just have to have that moment of, am I where I think I need to be? Am I fitting in with the group around me? Well, and as one last little point, I have to make note of that we're sometimes guilty of what's called the downward social comparison. Some of us have figured out, even unconsciously, that we compare ourselves to others. So we've figured out those individuals who are, or we perceive as, worse than us, and we like to compare ourselves to them. So that way, let's say that you made a D on your test, but you find some people in class who made an F, and you're like, well, at least I didn't make an F, right? Feel a little bit better about yourself. That's downward social comparison. All right, we're going to stop there. So we'll take a break. When we come back, we're going to look at your attitudes, your beliefs, and some of the forces that affect them. And then we'll move into some pro-social behavior, basically things like altruism and selflessness. See you then.